Alright, so with Florida recently removing themselves from the list of teams without a cup, and also in recent history seeing teams like Washington and St. Louis break long curses and years of playoff heartbreak to finally get their first cup, it got me thinking about the list of teams that are left who still haven't won one, and I wanted to dive in individually a little bit into each one with you guys, and especially if you're not part of the fan base of one of these 10 teams, I want to hear which one you want to see get their first cup the most. And I also want to clarify that we're only talking about current iterations of NHL franchises here, because like the old Ottawa Senators from 1883 apparently won 11 Stanley Cups. Or like the Vancouver Millionaires won the cup in 1915, but both the Canucks and current Senators franchises have never won the cup, so they're both on the list. Starting alphabetical order with Heartbreak City for a hockey fan lately, Buffalo. We all know about the 13-year playoff drought, losing superstars who go on to win cups elsewhere, to even just the endless coaching carousel that's come full circle right back to Lindy Ruff. It has not been easy to be a Buffalo Sabres fan for the past 15 years or so, which is why I want you guys back in the playoffs so bad. If you don't know the list of who hasn't won a cup, I mean, this one's not really surprising to find out. They've been in the cup final twice. They lost to the Flyers in 6 games in 1975, and then the really famous one in 1999 again in 6 games to the Dallas Stars. That's the Brett Hull foot in the crease one. That's one of the most famous and controversial goals in NHL history. They had a couple really good teams after that in the 2000s, notably the 06 team that lost to the eventual Stanley Cup champion Carolina Hurricanes, and the 07 team the following year that also lost in the third round to the Sens. There were a couple of close shaves there before spiraling into their decade and almost a half of darkness. Sorry, Oiler fans, I know that's your thing. Honestly, I'd love for this team to go on a deep run and win the cup. I'd be totally here for it, but they gotta make the playoffs first. That's step one here. You can't break the cupless drought without making it to the dance first. So I'm sure that's what most Sabres fans are focused on right now, is just getting back to the playoffs. Hopefully it happens sooner rather than later. Hang in there, Sabres fans. Your time will come. Up next, it's Columbus. They joined the league in 2000. It took them 9 years to make their first playoff appearance, in which they got swept by the Red Wings. This was back before Gary started treating his expansion teams like sweet little angels. Teams like Columbus, Nashville, Minnesota really had to grind it out for the first few years. It was not easy, especially for the Jackets. For a long while, that franchise really just was, oh hey sick, it's Rick Nash, and not much else. And once he got traded in 2012, it's like, alright, they're starting kind of from scratch here. What are the Columbus Blue Jackets going to be? They started to come out of it in 2014 when the guy who looked like he was going to be the next face of the franchise, Ryan Johansson, really stepped up as a number 1 centerman alongside guys like Nick Foligno, Cam Atkinson, Jack Johnson, and of course Sergei Bobrovsky. They got bounced in round 1 by Sid's Penguins, but you could definitely see the semblance of a new core starting to take shape here. Then in 2017, a franchise who'd only made the playoffs twice prior in their 17-year history, they went on to make the playoffs in 4 straight seasons, including a massive David versus Goliath type upset in 2019 against the Lightning. And that, I would argue, was the biggest season in this franchise's history. Not just because they made it to the second round for the first and only time so far, but this was probably the best team they've ever had. I mean, you had Sergei Bobrovsky and Artemi Panarin, 2 superstars leading the way, a fantastic leadership group spearheaded by guys like Nick Foligno, Cam Atkinson, future captain Boone Jenner, Brandon Dubinsky, David Savard, and more. You also had, it sounds really funny to say now, but look back at his stats, you'll see, a really promising up-and-coming player in Pierre-Luc Dubois, a solid D-core headlined by Zach Werenski and Seth Jones, and of course, who could forget about Torts behind the bench. The wildest part about that season for me though was seeing the Columbus Blue Jackets actually going out and buying at the deadline. Matt Duchene, Ryan Dzingel, Adam McQuaid, Kekalainen made a pretty eye-opening splash that year, and it led them to their best ever finish to a season. From there, I'm sure you know the story, the wheels started to fall off a little bit with so many players leaving. They kind of had to reconstruct their team on the fly a little bit, and now they've missed the playoffs for 4 straight seasons. For how much this team has endured over the years, they've got a sneaky great fan base who's very loyal and passionate. The fact that they've been through so much heartbreak with so many players leaving and scarce playoff appearances, they've never seen past Game 6 of Round 2. I remember seeing how nuts the fans were in a good way in the playoffs in 2019. The day this team does go all the way, it's going to be really cool to watch, even just as a general hockey fan. They've got a lot of work to do to get there, but that's going to be a cool day when it happens. Next, we got the state of hockey. It's the Minnesota Wild. By the way, it took me way too long to realize that the Wild logo is actually a bear. Let me know when you guys found that out, because for me, it took years. This team, despite coming in the league with Columbus, actually fared a lot better than them early on. In just their 3rd year, they went to the 3rd round against Anaheim, who ended up sweeping them. That's a team that J.S. Shiger won the Conn Smythe on a losing team. And since then, they've had a steady diet of playoff appearances. I mean, they had that little run from 09 to 12 where they didn't make it, but other than that, the XL Energy Center has seen quite a few playoff games. But they never made the 3rd round other than 03, and the only other times they were in the 2nd round were in the prime Kane, Taves, Keith years in Chicago, and guys like Parise, Suter, Koivu, and even last dance Danny Heatley were no match for them, unfortunately. This team's had some really cool players over the years. Marian Gaborik in his heyday was awesome, so much fun to watch. Mikko Koivu is obviously Mr. Minnesota Wild, and even now Kaprizov, like, people know how good he is, but I still think, as crazy as it might sound, he still might be a little underrated. He's just so electric and so good. Plus now you've got up Brock Faber, who's an absolute stud on D, Matt Boldy, Eric Sinek, Marco Rossi. Like, I know they just missed the playoffs, but things aren't looking too bad in Minnesota. Jesper Wallstedt, of course, too, that I didn't mention, especially as they move through the Suter Parise buyouts. They've got a good core here. Like, things could start looking pretty good in Minnesota again. That's a hockey-crazed city and even state that would just eat up a championship. They'd love it. And again, with guys like Wallstedt, Faber, Boldy, Rossi, I could see them being really good in the way that the Dallas model worked, getting guys like Robertson, Heiskanen, Ottinger, Wyatt Johnston, while still having a ton of money tied up in Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin. Next up is Nashville. Now, especially after the free agency they just had, this is one of the teams I definitely think is closer to breaking their cup drought, or can you even really call it a drought if you've never won the cup in the first place? I think they're closer to getting their first cup than a lot of teams on this list. All-world D-man, elite goaltender, elite offensive forward, arguably more than one now, very good two-way top six centerman who can win a ton of draws, put up points, and is super responsible defensively, plus some more really good help offensively and defensively. You look back at the 2017 club, the only Preds team to have gone to the cup final, they were really, really good, especially that back end. They still had Yossi, who, like I said, I think he's all-world. They had PK Subban, who was still top of his game at that point, and Matthias Ekholm, who's also a great defenseman. What he did as Bouchard's partner this past season, he did for PK Subban in 2017. And to round out the top four, Ryan Ellis was also a really good defenseman at that time. It was just an insane top four on D. Plus Pecorine was awesome, especially in the playoffs. 930, dude. He was playing out of his mind. Those were the two things that really drove the team that year. And of course, the big three on offense, Arvidsson, Forsberg, and Johansson. And you sprinkle in some scoring help from guys like James Neal, Colton Sissons, and a young Freddie Gaudreau coming out of nowhere. And voila, you've got your franchise's only Stanley Cup final appearance. They had some pretty good teams after that, but they just couldn't recapture that magic of 2017. Now here they are, retooled and seemingly ready to go. I'm not saying they're cup favorites, but I think they're in for a pretty good year. I think Stamkos and Marchessault are going to want to prove Tampa and Vegas wrong for making the decision that they did and going about it the way that they did, plus the other cornerstone pieces I mentioned, and the fact that they were already a good team before the free agency window. This year should be fun if you're a Preds fan. It definitely has some 2017 vibes, going into it at least. Ottawa, some kind of roller coaster you guys have been on for a while here. That 07 finals team was so much fun, like Alfredson at the top of his game, curved visor, height of his powers, 50-goal, 100-point Danny Heatley. Jason Spezza was cooking that year, Mike Fisher, Wade Redden, Chris Phillips, Chris Neal, Ray Emery, God rest his soul. This was honestly one of the most fun Sens teams I've ever watched, and if you are a Sens fan, give me your thoughts on that run and on that team, because I just remember thinking it was so cool. Until they ran into Scott Niedermayer, Teemu Solani, Chris Pronger, Young Perry, and Getzlaff and the boys, but still, every time somebody brings up the 2007 Sens, I can't help but smile. Then, 10 years later, that run, led by Erik Karlsson, Mike Hoffman, Mark Stone, Kyle Turris, Bobby Ryan, even Dion Phaneuf was on that team, and of course Craig Anderson between the pipes. Is he the best goalie in Sens history? He's got to be, right? That team was one Chris Kunitz flutter puck away from the Stanley Cup final. Had they made it there in overtime Game 7 instead of Sid's Penguins, I really think they would have had a legit shot against Nashville in 2017. How ironic we just talked about them. But instead, since that game, Ottawa hasn't seen a playoff game since, and not one player from that team remains, not even Alex Burrows. Hopefully the addition of Allmark really helps them this year, because if you were to ask me the one player I want to see the most in the playoffs, it's Brady Tkachuk, hands down. It just feels like that guy's built for playoff hockey, and the day we get to see it's going to be a good one. But similar to a team like Buffalo or Detroit, like the focus here should really just be on getting back into the playoffs themselves, and making at least a little bit of a run to give some valuable playoff experience to guys like Tkachuk, Stützle, Sanderson, even Shabbat's never played a playoff game. He's been there for a long time. And it does feel like Staios and the group, especially recently, are taking steps towards that. Because before breaking the cupless spell, like you gotta field a team that's good enough to give yourself a chance, aka make the playoffs. Time will tell if this is the year that happens. San Jose is an interesting one. They were really good for a long time. You think of the early Thornton Marlowe years, the ones with Nabokov, like they were making the playoffs, they were winning rounds, they were often stuck in the first or second round, and when they did get to the third round, they lost to the Flames in 04, and then got swept in 2010 by the eventual Cup champion Hawks. But they remained good. Like, don't get me wrong, there was plenty of heartbreak, like the Kevin Bieksa goal in 2011, blowing a 3-0 series lead in 2014, and Joe Thornton being stripped of the captaincy, and straight up missing the playoffs the next year in 2015. But by 2016, they seemed to rejuvenate it. Like Joe Pavelski was named captain after a year of it being vacant. Pete DeBoer came in to replace Todd McClellan, who was the coach there for a long time. They finally beat LA in a series after losing to them in two heartbreaking Game 7s in 2013 and 2014. And this time around, they did so pretty convincingly, 4-1. In my eyes, that was the first sign of like, oh, okay, this Sharks team is different than the previous ones who are in this position. Yes, you still have the usual suspects, Thornton, Marlowe, Pavelski, Couture, but they had a lot of extra help here. Brent Burns was good as a Shark, but by this point he had morphed into a complete superstar. Hurdle chipped in nicely, as well as Joel Ward and Jonas Donskoy, and Martin Jones. I know now it seems like, what? Really? Dude. He was so important to this run. He came up clutch, and all of a sudden, they're in the cup final against, this has become a recurring theme, Sid's Penguins. After that, you knew they were going to kind of regress. Like, these guys can't play forever, and they were so good for so long. It's just the natural cycle of a team, so now they're back in like the infancy stages of a rebuild. And we'll see what happens now with guys like Celebrini and Will Smith. Up next, Seattle, another team that I don't give enough love to on this channel. I'm going to try to talk about them more this upcoming season. Obviously, there's not much to go over here, but I will say 2 years ago, I didn't think they were going to make the playoffs. They surprised me there. I didn't think they were going to beat the defending cup champion Avalanche in round 1. They surprised me there too. And Dallas looked really good that year, so the fact that they took them to 7 games, at that point I was just like, wow, congrats Seattle Kraken, what a season. I will admit, I really wanted to see Battle of the Modern expansion drafts in the 3rd round between Vegas and Seattle that year, but nonetheless, what a great season, and it made me take them really seriously coming into this past year. And then they surprised me again by missing the playoffs this year. I honestly have no idea what to think about this team. Dan Bilesma's their coach now. Haven't seen that guy in a while, and I do like the moves of Brandon Montour and Chandler Stevenson. I think they'll definitely help, and Jared McCann's a star. Vince Dunn is very good. They definitely need more from Matty Beniers this year. He's coming off a bit of a sophomore slump. All in all though, especially with that 2023 playoff run, it's been a pretty pleasant start for the Kraken and their fans in the NHL. Alright, now on to Utah, formerly Arizona, formerly Winnipeg. This is a weird one because I do want to keep it specific to the fan base of the team, because I don't know how many fans in Utah followed or cared about the Arizona Coyotes before they knew that they were coming to Utah. So technically this franchise has been around for a while and has seen names like Keith Tkachuk, Shane Doan, Jeremy Roenick, Pavel Datsyuk in a weird way, but also this current iteration of this franchise hasn't seen a single game. And whichever way you slice it, the franchise hasn't won a cup. It does feel kind of weird to reminisce about the 2012 Phoenix Coyotes for the Utah side of things, but just know that that team led by Mike Smith, Martin Hanzal, and Shane Doan obviously was super cool. And for Utah, we were told owner Ryan Smith wanted to spend, he wanted to make the team a lot better, and I absolutely think he's done that. Not just through trade, but at the draft too. TJ Ginla, you guys know how I feel about him. I think he's going to be like a cornerstone piece. Josh Doan looks promising, Sergachev especially, but also John Marino. They're going to make a difference for that decor. Connor Ingram's a really good goalie, and you've got the young guys, Logan Cooley, Dylan Gunther, of course Clayton Keller, he's the straw that stirs the drink. I think they're going to be good in year 1. Buckle up, Salt Lake. Up next we got Vancouver. Oh, Vancouver. First there was 1982 where they got swept by the Islanders. You've got 94 against the Rangers. That's the year, albeit the series before, where Mark Messier made the guarantee that they would win Game 6. The Canucks had Pavel Bure, Kirk McLean. They were wearing those beautiful skate jerseys full time. Then 2011 against Boston. You guys probably know the story. It's probably one of the most well-known Stanley Cup finals ever. The Canucks were just so good that year. I remember thinking for probably the majority of the playoffs, like the Canucks are going to win the Stanley Cup here. They're just too good, especially when they went up 3-2 in the final against the Bruins. The Sedins were so elite that year. Kessler was top of his game. Burroughs was something else that year too. He was so much fun to watch. Then of course on the back end you had Bieksa, Ehrhoff, Edler, and you already know Luongo and net. That team had so much personality on it between Luongo, Kessler, Bieksa, even guys like Raffi Torres, Tanner Glass, Max Lapierre coming over from Anaheim. I know people tend to talk about what happened after Game 7, but the actual team itself was so entertaining. And now 13 years later, I'm happy to report that the Canucks are good again, and they certainly don't look far off from contending for a cup, and not just because they went to Game 7 of the second round. They're set in net with 2 really good goalies. They've got an elite, now Norris Trophy winning defenseman in Quinn Hughes, who's also good defensively by the way. He doesn't just put up points. They've locked in his running mate Hronek as well. We've seen just how valuable JT Miller is. Best wishes to Brock Besser. Hopefully he can come back sooner rather than later. He had a great season. I know Pettersson didn't look quite right in the playoffs and through parts of the season, but I still believe that when he's healthy and when he's right, he can absolutely be one of the best offensive players in the world. And with Rick Tocchet behind the bench, I think that guy's such a good coach. With the people they have in the organization right now, I think the Canucks are in a window here where they're going to have some good opportunities to go and break this cupless spell. The question is, do they take them? And finally, the Winnipeg Jets. My Stanley Cup was all the crazy PR stuff they did with the Atlanta Thrashers mascot back in the day to try to save the franchise. But nope, they still ended up in Winnipeg post Kovalchuk though. Could you imagine if Kovalchuk was a Jet? At that time too, when he was still a star. Even still though, it's been a wild ride for this team since coming back to Manitoba in 2011. From Andrew Ladd, Brian Little, and young Evander Kane, to Big Buff becoming one of the biggest fan favorites I've seen in any market, to Patrick Laine looking like the next great goal scorer, to Pierre-Luc Dubois, to now. There are still some remnants of the old of cores like Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, Connor Hellebuck, Nikolai Ehlers, although not sure how long that one's going to last. But despite having the same GM through it all, it really feels like this team's gone through a bunch of different eras since coming back in 2011. In 2015, they finally got to bring the Winnipeg Whiteout back, and it's been awesome in the playoffs ever since. For this iteration of the Jets, the Magic season was 2017-18, was the first time they won a playoff game and a playoff series. They beat a really good Nashville team in round 2 that was such a hard-fought series. And then they got taken out by the expansion darlings, the Golden Misfits, in 5 games. Derek Englund and the boys got to lift the Western Conference trophy in Winnipeg, and since then they've still been good. They made the playoffs quite a bit, but they've only won 1 playoff round since that 2018 run. And these are teams that have been built to go deep, especially this past one against Colorado. You look at some of the moves they made at the deadline. Connor Hellebuck ended up winning the Vezina. Cheveldayoff and the crew are clearly trying to make some hay here, and they have been for a while. Is this one of those cases where it's like, give them more time, they're going to get over the hump, or is it one of them where it's like, they're never going to, they can't? I honestly don't know. This team is really puzzling to me. I could definitely see them breaking through, kind of like the 2018 Caps, where they kept winning President's trophies. They were so good in the regular season, but year after year they would come up short, and you would hear that they can't win. This group cannot win. And when the expectations on them started to fade, that's when they finally broke through. That being said, I wouldn't bank on it because, like I said, this team is such a puzzle to me. That'll do for this one, guys. If you want more content like this, let me know by liking the video, please, and subscribe if you're new as well. This took a long time to make, but it was a ton of fun, so I'd love to do more if you want. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having an awesome summer. See you in the next one.